This week in Beijing, the world saw a striking image. Xi Jinping standing alongside Vladimir Putin, Kim Jong-un, and Iran's President Masoud Pezeshkian. Four leaders, all under Western sanctions, sharing the stage at a military parade. For many, it symbolized a deepening alignment among powers challenging the rules-based order. For Iran, the timing was critical. Its nuclear program has come under Israeli and U.S. attack. Europe has triggered the snapback mechanism, and the UN's nuclear watchdog now says Iran's growing stockpile of highly enriched uranium is, quote, a matter of serious concern, with inspectors locked out since Israeli strikes in June. Tehran is increasingly isolated, and one of its few remaining partners is Russia, a country it has cooperated with from Syria to Ukraine. So what role will Moscow play now? A defender, a mediator, or something else? And what does this mean for Iran's nuclear strategy, for diplomacy with the West, and for the risk of a wider conflict? To unpack this, I'm joined by Nicole Grajewski, a fellow at the Carnegie Endowment's Nuclear Policy Program and author of Russia and Iran, Partners in Defiance from Syria to Ukraine.
I mean, the big risk, and this is what the Iranians have been threatening, is the withdrawal from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty.
She has spent years tracing this relationship from the battlefields of Syria to the war in Ukraine, and now to the nuclear standoff we're facing today. I'm Negar Moshehedi, and this is Eye for Iran. Nicole Grajewski joins us now on Eye for Iran. Thank you so much for being here, Nicole.
Thank you so much for having me.
And Nicole, I just ordered your book, Russia and Iran, Partners in Defiance from Syria to Ukraine, pre-ordered on Amazon, and looking forward to reading it soon. So congratulations on that. That's a big achievement.
Oh, thank you so much. And thank you so much for ordering it. I really appreciate it.
Of course, of course. Nicole, you specialize in Iran, Russia, and nuclear policy. Tell us a little bit about what drew you into that field.
Well, I primarily started through the Russia angle. I did my master's in Russian studies at Oxford, but then it became increasingly clear that the Russia-Iran relationship was actually understudied. This was prior to the war in Ukraine and prior to the developments really with Syria. But eventually, throughout the course of this, it became clear that the role of Russia in the Iran nuclear program, and also in general, the Russia-Iran relationship was so critical and crucial to international security. And now we really see the impact of this relationship really since the war in Ukraine, but even since the 12-day war and the current impasse over Iran's nuclear issue.
Yeah, let's talk about that impact. And your specialization is incredibly topical. So given your field research and your expertise, how would you characterize the relationship between Russia and Iran right now, especially after the 12-day war? And has it shifted? Has it changed? Is it what you had expected? And if you could also give us a little bit about, walk us through the key stages of that relationship, because the dynamic between Tehran and Moscow has shifted depending on the historical period. I mean, for example, if you compare during the period of Ahmadinejad to now, it's completely different. So yeah, walk us through those stages. And also, again, how has the relationship, if at all, has it shifted since the 12-day war, and how would you describe it and characterize it?
Yeah, I mean, it's traditionally been a very fraught and complicated relationship. There's a lot of historical animosity on the Iranian side, and this goes back to the imperial Qajar era, for example, with Russian kind of territorial grabs and kind of, I guess, concessions that the Iranians had to make back then. But, the Russia-Iran relationship shifted a lot after the collapse of the Soviet Union, where Russia became a crucial arms partner for Iran, but also a supplier of civilian nuclear energy. That, of course, had some tensions. The impact of the United States frequently led to Russia reneging on agreements or delaying arms deals with the Iranians. Then, with the issue with the Iranian nuclear program, when it really became more salient in the 2000s, the Russians would simultaneously block certain measures that imposed pressure on Iran, but also support sanctions on Iran in the UN Security Council. So they kind of played this dual game with the Iranians. And we really did see this in 2010 and 2011 with some of the support of UN sanctions, where actually I believe there were statements where the Iranians accused the Russians of caving into Satan by supporting the United States. And so there's frequently been accusations by the Iranians that the Russians have used them as a bargaining chip with the United States. And we saw that with the Iran nuclear file. The relationship relationship really shifted partly because of domestic issues within Russia with Putin and protests and kind of the hardening of the Russian foreign policy apparatus around the domestic protests within Russia in 2011, 2012. But then also with the Syrian civil war, where for the first time actually in modern Russian history, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia actually deployed military force outside of the post-Soviet space. And they did so with Iranian boots on the ground and in collaboration with Hezbollah and Iranian-backed groups. And this is where the relationship really became more institutionalized. There was always tensions here, and there's always been tensions in the relationship, but there was a bureaucratic level of coordination that was really unprecedented. And the tasks of coordinating a military campaign, that's quite a bit of effort and coordination. And so that's when the relationship really shifts and you see it becoming a bit more symbiotic. And of course, with the war in Ukraine in 2022, when the Russians were looking for extra ammunition and drones, they turned to Iran, and they had that kind of institutional backing that was already there. And that's where you see this relationship actually becoming much more prominent on the international stage. The Russians started backing Iran much more in international forums. And so there was an assumption when the 12-day war erupted that the Russians would come to Iran's aid. I think that fundamentally misinterprets the nature of the Russia-Iran relationship. So on one hand, the Russians and the Iranians have supported each other when it's expedient. But also, the Russians and Iranians never really committed to a mutual defense agreement. Iran was very enthusiastic to export drones to the Russians, at least parts of the Iranian establishment, like the IRGC, because it allowed it to use its equipment against NATO and Western artillery and weapons. So it kind of showed that Iran was this international arms exporter. It allowed it to actually have a bit of leverage over the Russians. But the Russians and the Iranians explicitly do not have a mutual defense agreement. And that was partly because Iran did not want to be drawn into the war through boots on the ground in Ukraine, but also because the Russians would not want to come to Iran's aid during a conflict with the U.S. or Israel. And to be fair, there was very little the Russians could have done during the 12-day war. Air defense systems, if they were to deliver them to the Iranians, they take about 6 to 8 months for training. So they would have to, have that much time is very compressed within 12 days. That wouldn't have been possible.
Well, and the S-300s didn't prove to be that successful either, did it? In terms of...
Well, the issue with Iran, and this has always been kind of their issues, having an integrated air defense network. And, Iran does have S-300s, which are their most advanced air defense system. However, that's still not sufficient really to deal with, Israeli aircraft and, fly. And frankly, they didn't perform as well as I think actually the Israelis even assumed. I think that the Israelis calculated that they would actually incur potentially some more damage, but the S-300s didn't really perform well. One of the things was, though, in the October strikes, a lot of the radar, so the acquisition radars, which basically identify incoming aircraft or incoming munitions, those were destroyed by the Israelis. And it's unclear if the Russians replaced that, though there had been evidence that Russians, I think Reuters reported that the Russian air defense advisors were traveling to Iran around that time.
Yes, that's correct, yeah.
Yeah, so that was an issue there. Iran has their own domestic analogs, but at the same time, Iran's air defense network is nowhere where it needed to be to withstand the Israeli Air Force. And so the Russians really couldn't do that much at that time.
So what's next then, given that relationship that you've established, which really sounds like, correct me if I'm wrong, like a relationship of convenience, right?
Yeah, I think they're bound together by what they oppose. It's less of this kind of like relationship where they have this mutual value of like democracy or, human rights. In fact, actually, their opposition to those issues are kind of what draws them together. Both countries want to see the survival of their regimes, so they cooperate a lot of times on domestic repression. And they also have this antipathy and acrimonious relationship towards the West. And so that kind of binds them together. And when it is convenient, they do cooperate. But there is that kind of overarching narrative of defiance and resistance that has bound that relationship over time.
So given that linkage and also Russia's linkage to Iran's nuclear file, if you will, what realistically could Moscow do now, if at all? You mentioned that they couldn't do much after the 12-day war. Is there anything they can do now with the E3 snapbacks? And could Russia use Iran as leverage, even against the U.S. over the war in Ukraine, like in terms of potentially selling Tehran out. You've mentioned that they've done that in the past when they've needed to. Do you foresee that happening now? And is there anything that they can do beyond rhetoric at this point? Because, I mean, you've got China, Russia, and Iran. They signed a joint letter to the United Nations calling the E3 snapbacks, or the so-called snapbacks, unlawful. Can they do anything realistically beyond that? And would they sell Tehran out?
I mean, so there's several dimensions of this. I mean, there's the Russian state is by no means monolithic, and there's also the potential area where Russia may be helping with some dual-use technologies in order for Iran to maybe eventually get to the nuclear threshold. And that there's been reports about some Iranian delegations visiting Russia, for example, to get aid and assistance on certain types of nuclear technology. In terms of the E3 snapback, Russia's already come up with a counter resolution to extend snapback, or UNSCR 2231, for 6 months. And I think it's only one paragraph, and it's trying to procedurally block what the E3 is trying to do. Russia assumes the presidency of the UN Security Council in October, and this is why this kind of snapback is starting right now, so it can avoid that. In terms of what Russia can do, I think Russia could try to garner some coalition of countries. It seems like Russia may be helping Iran with their legal argument against the legitimacy of snapback. But if snapback goes forward, Russia can also cause problems with like panel of experts, for example, or investigations into Iran's nuclear program, which were part of these sanctions. So they could do a lot of procedural issues in the UN, and the Russians are very adept at that. I mean, this is something that the Russians have quite a particular skill in, is actually using the UN system to its advantage. I mean, they created the snapback mechanism as kind of a bargain with the US and the French during the negotiations. So there's a level of irony there.
Well, yeah, it's interesting because the actual word snapback cannot be found in the Resolution 2231, right?
Yeah, I mean, so it basically was crafted. There was some debate on like how do we enforce this agreement, and it was crafted as a way if any country thought that Iran was not complying or was in significant non-performance of its obligations. That's where you find it, that all previous UN sanctions that were on Iran would be reimposed. And so that's kind of like this interesting legal mechanism where Russia and China can't really veto this. Actually, in order to pass it, it has to get vetoed. So it's a kind of complicated mechanism that the Russians actually crafted in order to prevent renewing the resolution every 90 days. This was in 2015. So, that's basically the basis of snapback.
That's very ironic then, as you mentioned.
Yeah. So going forward, I think it's mostly going to be procedural with the role of the Russians. In terms of selling out Iran with the United States over negotiations with Ukraine, that's unclear. I mean, it doesn't seem like the U.S. is explicitly linking this. I mean, during the 12-day war, Trump said he had a call with Putin, and he said that he understands the Iranians very well, and the Russians certainly have the Iran card to play. But it's a question of what will they be able to do, and will they be able to get Iran to admit inspectors? I think that development recently, I think it was last week with inspectors at Bushehr, was quite interesting. It seemed like the Russians and the Iranians coordinated with this to show that Iran is somewhat cooperating with the IAEA, and they're visiting Bushehr, which is a Russian designed nuclear power plant within Iran. So there's a lot of procedural issues that are quite interesting that they're playing out at the moment.
And this week we also saw Iran at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in the port city of Tianjin in China, and also at the Beijing Massive Victory Day military parade. And obviously the president of Iran, Pezeshkian, was standing alongside Xi Jinping, Putin, Kim Jong-un. What do you make of that image, and what message, if at all, does it send in your view?
So the Shanghai Cooperation Organization has been a longstanding goal of Iran to join, and eventually when they did, I think it was in 2023, it was quite a big accomplishment for them. But it's really symbolic. I mean, it shows that Iran isn't isolated, and it shows that Iran has these kind of powerful partners that, could provide aid. If anything, the Chinese and the North Koreans are probably more important for Iran to reconstitute and rebuild, because China has their defense industry is not as constrained as
more than the Russians, eh?
I would say that the Chinese are not as constrained as the Russians are in terms of their defense industry, in terms of rebuilding. And of course, the North Koreans have helped Iran with their missile cities and a lot of their missile technology. And so maybe the Russians can provide, the kind of above ground, conventional weaponry and stuff. But it's really the Chinese, I think, that would be the prize for the Iranians if they could obtain some Chinese technology, because China's defense industry is just not as constrained as the Russians. And they're more likely to accept payments with credit, where the Russians really want a capital or some kind of quid pro quo with drones, for example. And of course, the North Koreans have been willing to provide Iran with, technology related to nuclear weapons, but also towards its missile program. So those two countries, in some ways, are more important in that end. But yes, it just shows that Iran. The symbolic significance of it, I think, is that primarily we haven't seen. There's nothing really substantial about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It's really a kind of big group of autocrats with, some observer states. India and Pakistan are members, which kind of makes the cohesion a little bit more difficult because it's based on consensus. The SCO said nothing during the missile exchanges between India and Pakistan, and also between Iran and Pakistan. So they had, member states actually firing missiles at each other, and they weren't able to really accomplish any kind of peace or security there. So it's not a substantial organization. It's really just a club for autocrats.
And beyond the symbolism, do you foresee the Chinese taking on an initiative like this to help the Iranians rebuild? I would assume there'd be the risk of sanctions from the Trump administration.
Well, certainly if the UN sanctions with the snapback are reinstated, this would, really complicate any effort for Iran to get weaponry, because they would be under the conventional arms embargo. That doesn't include air defense systems. So air defense systems are defensive in nature, and they're not covered under that embargo. And this is why, actually, there was a lot of tensions between the Iranians and Russians back in 2010 when the Russians actually canceled the sale of the S-300 to the Iranians, citing the UN Security Council resolution that imposed sanctions on conventional arms sales, because that didn't cover air defense systems. So that would complicate it to some extent, maybe U.S. sanctions as well. And it's unclear if the Chinese really want to provide Iran with this kind of weaponry. And so thus far, it's only really been Chinese commentators. We haven't seen any major Iranian delegations traveling to China, military delegations, whether it be IRGC or conventional Artesh. We haven't seen that yet. So it is unclear if the Chinese are willing to fulfill that role.
So going back to the E3 that you mentioned, and you said that the snapback was deliberate in terms of the timing, because you said that Russia's got its presidency at the UN coming up in October. So what are some of the risks if the snapback is approved?
The big risk, and this is what the Iranians have been threatening, is the withdrawal from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Actually, I believe it was in the Iranian foreign minister's letter to the UN where he stated that Iran's supreme national security interests were at risk. This is directly the wording within the withdrawal clause on the NPT, or the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So this is a threat that's been looming for quite a while. They've also threatened to, cancel or fully cease cooperation with the IAEA, the UN nuclear watchdog, though that wouldn't really be so substantial because
they're already doing it.
Yeah, I know. So there wouldn't be that much of an impact there. So it's really, on the terms of the Iran nuclear issue, it would be NPT withdrawal. Iran, and there's also the risk of, Iran withdrawing in another 12-day war, another Israeli strike on Iran, using that as a pretext. So the snapback does carry risks. Iran could be bluffing. That's also a possibility as well. So you could see Iran continue to make these threats about NPT withdrawal, but just wait out the sanctions like they did in previous administrations, where they actually did, endure, the sanctions before.
And what about the credibility of global non-proliferation, like the regime itself of global non-proliferation? What does that do to it in that sense?
I mean, the non-proliferation regime was already pretty fraught. I mean, you see Russia targeting nuclear power plants in the war in Ukraine. The great powers that possess nuclear weapons, the P5, hadn't really made any progress when it comes towards disarmament. All of the arms control treaties, really except for a New START between the U.S. and Russia, are about to expire or have been either abrogated or, pretty much eroded. And so New START's about to expire in 2026. And then, of course, there's always been these double standards in the regime. I think it was the real impact of it was that, Israel's not part of the non-proliferation regime, and Israel likely has nuclear weapons. I mean, they deny this. And so a country outside of the NPT attacking a country with a very dubious and controversial history of nuclear activity, but nonetheless attacking a country that is a member of the NPT, I think that was somewhat of a precedent that seemed to erode the non-proliferation regime, though this is not the sole cause of it by any means.
So let's talk about Iran's nuclear strategy and some of the causes. So the UN nuclear watchdog, the IAEA, recently said that Iran's inventory of highly enriched uranium is, quote, a matter of serious concern, saying it has no visibility since Tehran's activities since the Israeli strikes in June, that Iran was enriching just prior to the strikes itself. And we know that it had been enriching to at least 60%. Obviously, the strikes with Israel, their proxies with Arab neighbors that a lot of experts say has destabilized those countries like Lebanon, for example, and reinforcing sites like Fordo after the Israeli attacks. Do these steps add up to a coherent strategy on Iran's part, or do they leave Iran stuck with neither the protection of real nuclear deterrence nor the credibility needed for serious political diplomatic leverage here?
So the HEU stockpile, which allegedly remains intact from what we know, that is a point of leverage. I mean, the IAEA definitely would like to verify that. I think any country who is concerned about Iran potentially obtaining a nuclear weapon would be quite concerned and like to verify at least the remnants of part of its nuclear program. There is, the Iranians haven't really been clear about their strategy going forward. The use of kind of this non-weaponized deterrence, their nuclear program that was on the brink of actually becoming weaponized, didn't really deter an Israeli attack. And it was destroyed pretty much within the span of less than 2 weeks. However, there is, the real worry, and I think this is why IAEA access is really important, is that Iran could go deeper underground and they can scale down the production of centrifuges and work with a much smaller program with whatever remains. So, for example, producing uranium metal at a much smaller facility, advancing its centrifuges at a much smaller facility in a covert program underground, kind of evading detection. And that's a concern, I think, going forward. And of course, with that HEU stockpile, that would be crucial for Iran to really restart its nuclear program, as well as the centrifuge components, which we're unsure where some of them are because the IAEA hasn't verified them since, I believe, February of 2021. And also because Iran, has been able to operate clandestinely in the past, prior to 2003 with kind of a weapons program. So this isn't a great situation for Iran either, because they are at risk for further Israeli strikes, though at the moment I think the main concern should be verification and discovering really what is left of this program.
There are a lot of external factors here, but how much of it then, if at all, in your view, is Iran's own fault with their own policies?
Well, Iran has made so many terrible decisions. I think in my view, in my opinion, I think their biggest mistake was consistently showing off their capabilities, which actually showed that their capabilities were not as strong as I think Western intelligence and Israeli intelligence assumed. I mean, the April and October strikes really showed the limitations on Iran's missile force. This is distinct from the 2019 kind of flare-ups in the tanker wars kind of tanker targeting, and also the attacks on Saudi Aramco, where there was, more accuracy, and these these were obviously smaller operations. I think Iran overplayed its hand. They overextended with the axis of resistance, and that proved to be quite hollow. And they also showed that they weren't this kind of formidable like missile force that they were trying to portray themselves as. And I think that really impacted Israeli thinking when it came to Operation Rising Lion, was the limitations on Iran's ability to actually retaliate and impose kind of irreparable costs. And that was partly because of the April and October strikes. I mean, there is a whole host of other problems and mistakes that Iran has made along the way. But in terms of the more immediate context, I would say that, I mean, Iran could have chosen to be a normal country integrated into the international community. They had not done so. I think that there could have been openings, and we know this with some agreement during the Biden administration, where Iran could have achieved some kind of interim agreement with the Europeans, but they pushed back on that. So partly, I think it has to do with the nature of the system there, but also the stubbornness, I think, of officials and kind of the lack of foresight when it came to their capabilities and also Israeli resolve.
So they overplayed their hand, and now they don't have a coherent strategy is essentially it, right, at this point?
I would say so. I mean, I wouldn't underestimate their ability to endure suffering. I mean, or to actually cause the population to endure suffering. We've seen them do this time and time again. And they, I think that the regime, because this is a regime that is so concerned about its own survival, that there's going to be some type of innovation as long as they can kind of sustain this apparatus that they have. It doesn't seem like the only coherent strategy seems to be for the regime to survive and to endure this next episode of tension. Going forward, I haven't seen, or at least there hasn't been clear indications that they have really any kind of path going forward beyond just kind of retrenchment in a sense.
And has that failure in some ways maybe strengthened its adversaries, like Netanyahu giving him some ammunition to argue that Iran's bomb is imminent and leaving, ordinary Iranians trapped between, sanctions without the security or prestige that nuclear capability is allegedly supposed to bring?
I mean, I wouldn't say that. I think Iran's actions throughout the region, that's really, I think, strengthened a lot of animosity towards Iran. However, I think also the current situation between Israel and Gaza has also equally been detrimental to Netanyahu's reputation.
Course, yeah.
So I wouldn't say that there was a direct correlation there, though. I mean, from my understanding, is Israel saw this more as an opportunity, not as a reaction to any kind of new intelligence on Iran's program. So the timing of Operation Rising Lion was not in reaction to brand new revelations that they hadn't known like 3 months prior. It was really because this was an opening, and they saw it as kind of the moment to seize like the initiative. There was, the element of surprise because negotiations were ongoing. So that's, I think, was kind of in the Israeli calculation.
So a bomb threat then wasn't imminent. Is that?
Well, I think even back in January of this year, indications about Iran's ability to have a nuclear weapon was about like 1 year to 6 months. Because, Iran might have the fissile material, and, enrichment becomes progressively easier as you increase in levels. But the process of weaponization is a whole other issue. I mean, nuclear weapons are, technology from the 1940s, really. This isn't, that complex, at least the type of nuclear weapon that Iran might have been trying to make. But there is the process of weaponizing. And so you have to actually take that highly enriched uranium, you have to turn it into a metallic form, into a usable device, like a missile or some sort of delivery vehicle. And that takes time. So the threat of Iran obtaining a nuclear weapon wasn't imminent, but it could have been, 1 year to 6 months, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So essentially, is it fair to say that it was blown out of proportion potentially, in that sense?
I mean, look, the strike set Iran's program back. It didn't erase the knowledge. I think that it's unclear what we could have achieved with diplomacy, and it's also clear that military action alone can't solve the Iranian nuclear issue. So it is somewhat of a catch-22. I think people have ruminated a lot on the withdrawal from the JCPOA. That kind of, is, I think, counterproductive. At the moment, I think what really should be the focus is on what we need to do now. Military action already happened. Parts of Iran's program were destroyed or at least set back, but Iran does have the knowledge. There are scientists. They did create this kind of apparatus of not only scientists involved with the past nuclear weapons efforts who were assassinated, but also a cadre of students, protégés who also continue with that knowledge. On top of that is that Iran does have parts of its program still in the country. So, and how to address that, I think, is going to be the big question going forward. Whether that's further military action, that can only probably set the program back a few years to months. It's very it's such a difficult situation that there really seems like the solution right now is unclear.
And some analysts, like Valianas, argue that Iran's nuclear program is really about deterrent strategy. And he points to it being a deliberate choice, that it's not a sprint for the bomb like we saw with India and Pakistan, for example. But there are others, like for other analysts like Mark Dubovitz, for example, with the Foundation for Defensive Democracies, who points to the 60% enriched uranium, which is beyond civilian use. And he says, the negotiations are a cover to advance the program, that it is about the bomb. So after the 12-day war, which of these views do you think better explains Tehran's approach right now? And has it changed? Maybe it was something before and now it's changed after the 12-day war. What do you think?
I think if Iran wanted a bomb, they would have had one, to be honest. And I think that the 12-day war has actually provided some sustenance to some of the views within Iran that were calling for it. Iran had parts of there's two sides of this. I think Iran did view the 60% enrichment, also the 20% enriched uranium, as somewhat of a source of leverage in negotiations. And they did, this was quite conscious. At the same time, they did have dual use research that was ongoing that would, if Iran made that decision, be very relevant and would help expedite the process to obtain a nuclear weapon. So I don't think that Iran at the time of the 12-day war made the decision to have a nuclear weapon, but they wouldn't have had that much difficulty if they wanted to.
So has it made the situation worse then since the 12-day war and since military action? Or are we in a safer spot now because it did set it back somewhat? What do you think about that then?
I think it's actually it's not quite clear. So to some extent, Iran was operating a lot of these, actually all of these facilities were under IAEA safeguards. So at least there was, or not all of them, but they were ideally supposed to be under IAEA safeguards. And you did have inspectors going to Iran to verify parts of Iranian enrichment. Some of the, since February 2021, Iran really pushed back on inspections on other facilities, but, Fordow and Natanz were under IAEA inspections, and Esfahan as well. And so that was, beneficial. Uranium metal, that was a facility that was destroyed at Esfahan, that sets Iran back. But that also means that Iran might go more covert. And these facilities that Iran might operate might not be under IAEA safeguards, and they might be, immune to detection. And that's, I think, where it becomes kind of a mixed result here. It's, we lost a lot of visibility into the Iran nuclear program, but we also now risk Iran continuing to operate on a more covert basis, even though some facilities are destroyed. And so that's, I think, the big concern.
So let's talk about U.S. policy then with regards to that. A few weeks ago on Eye for Iran, we had Alan Ear on the program. He was a former Obama-era negotiator and also Persian language spokesperson for the Obama administration. He argued essentially that the U.S. has handed over the Iran nuclear file to Israel, and that under the Trump administration, unlike Obama, in his view, that Trump has really deprioritized the Iran nuclear file. How do you assess that?
Well, for a period of time, the Trump administration was interested in the Iran nuclear file. I mean, I think you saw that earlier this year, around March, until I think around May, there was interest in the Iran nuclear file. And then the 12-day war happened. And it did seem like the U.S., I mean, the Israelis wouldn't have gone and done this operation without U.S. forbearance. This is the nature of the U.S.-Israel relationship. It seems like the Trump administration now is focused on the war in Ukraine. And to some extent Gaza, but the Iran nuclear file doesn't seem to be a priority for the U.S. at the moment. Israel's been more quiet about Iran in the past few weeks.
Why do you think?
I'm not sure, actually. I mean, you just haven't seen as many statements out of the Israelis as before. I think there's been a few. I think one, to be honest, there hasn't been much beyond kind of intelligence leaks of things that we already knew prior to the war, like some report about potentially Iran doing research on thermonuclear weapons prior to the 12-day war. But there hasn't been as many threats, I think. I mean, the snapback that provoked an Israeli reaction, but it wasn't this continuous stream of Israeli statements about Iran and the danger of a nuclear weapon as we saw prior to the 12-day war. So I think that's somewhat interesting. But it seems like the U.S. is less engaged in the issue of the Iran nuclear issue. I wouldn't say that they're kind of outsourcing it to the Israelis. I think it's, the nature of international relations is that multiple countries have their own imperatives. And if anything, right now, it seems like the Europeans are taking a much larger role on the Iran nuclear file than the United States. And whether or not the U.S. is outsourcing to them, that's another question, and how much coordination is going on there. But the Europeans, the E3, are really leading kind of the tempo at the moment.
Yeah, and they've really hardened their stance over the years. So why do you suppose that the U.S. is really, should they be playing a role with the E3 now? Like, are they doing enough? Should they be interjecting themselves in the midst of these E3 or the snapbacks with the E3? Should the U.S. take on a greater role? Is there room for them to do something to bring about some sort of solution here?
I mean, one of the E3 conditions is actually the resumption of negotiations with the United States, also IAEA inspections and verifying Iran's HEU stockpile in order to extend snapback or avoid snapback. The U.S. has indicated, there's been phone calls with Rubio that they've supported snapback, but the U.S. should be involved in this and should be more involved in this, or at least playing a greater role.
How so?
I mean, I think the resumption of direct talks or indirect talks with the Iranians, whether it be Witkoff or Rubio, would be helpful, at least for IAEA inspections. But again, I mean, the Iran nuclear deal was really a European deal. It originated with the Europeans, with the French, the British, and the Germans back in the 2000s, following the revelations of Iran's covert civilian nuclear program at the time. And so that kind of became the basis for discussions. The Bush administration wasn't really involved in that. And so you kind of see that parallel right now. However, Iran views the E3 as much more in line with the U.S. position as they did, I think, during the Bush administration, where they seem to be more of an intermediary or middle ground. I think a lot of the statements from the 12-day war and afterwards is that Iran viewed them as complicit in the strikes. And so, because obviously they put forward a resolution of the IAEA the day before the strikes about Iran's pre-2003 activities. And the IAEA Board of Governors found Iran in non-compliance of its safeguard obligations. That was the first time, since 2006. So there was kind of this momentum that was already occurring that Iran has lost a lot of, faith or goodwill towards the E3 at the moment. I think they like more than the E3.
I was going to say, I was reading in one of your commentaries that you proposed the U.S. should possibly extend the snapback itself before the sanctions come in place. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so under the U.S. technically, the U.S. is in an interesting legal position here because they're no longer a party to the JCPOA. What the U.S. can do is help shape this resolution. That's currently the E3 has a resolution about kind of imposing snapback sanctions again, but they could also help draft a resolution either with the E3 or alone on extending UNSCR 2231 with certain conditions to it. So tying those conditions to Iran, allowing inspectors to monitor their facilities, and verifying their HEU stockpile. So actually codifying this within international law. And that's, I think, something would be helpful because that would provide at least a process or some kind of structure for going forward with negotiations. To be honest, as it doesn't seem like the U.S. has been really taking the initiative on that or even showing a kind of desire to do so.
And if you look at, Washington's role, in general, and given the region, we are at greater risk potentially for another conflict, another round of war, maybe between Iran and Israel. Iran has been essentially, like you mentioned before, pushed closer to Russia and China. And there's even talk of Iran leaving the NPT at a time when visibility of its program is nearly zero. Have hawkish voices kind of on both sides, both Iran and the United States, have they put the situation in more of a dangerous state of affairs than potentially the imperfect but verifiable constraints that we had with the JCPOA?
I mean, the JCPOA was imperfect, and a lot of those provisions are set to expire soon anyway. But I think had the JCPOA remained in force, we probably wouldn't have seen the 12-day war. And Iran would, from my view, is this: I think Iran would have continued with their missile activity. They would have continued with their conventional capabilities. You wouldn't have seen Iran possessing a stockpile of 60% highly enriched uranium without any kind of detection, right? So obviously, they declared these activities, but had the JCPOA been in force, Iran would have been limited to 3.67% enrichment. And so in some ways, I mean, we can't really go back and, this is a counterfactual, of course. I think the international community would have been better off if the JCPOA remained in force. That being said, there were limits to the JCPOA. And, Iran, some of these activities related to weaponization work weren't really clearly articulated. And there was obviously the sunset provisions. And so that doesn't mean that, there could have been more hawkish voices in Iran calling for a nuclear weapons program after some of these sunset provisions expired. But I think in general, we would have likely seen less direct conflict between Iran and Israel. That doesn't mean that the axis of resistance wouldn't have been impacted. I think that's a whole other issue that was really set in motion by the October 7th and also kind of the hollowing of the Assad regime. So these are interesting counterfactuals. They obviously connect to each other, but I do think in general the more hawkish views ended up impacting at least the Iran nuclear issue more adversely.
And if you look at someone like Ali Larijani, who's Khamenei's advisor, he's also the head of the Supreme National Security Council. This week he said he's open to talks, but then he blamed Washington, said that they're stonewalling for raising the Iran's missile program, which was one of the major criticisms of the and shortcomings of the JCPOA. And then we've got Iran's foreign minister Abbas Araghchi saying this week that the Europeans have essentially acquiesced to the US and Israel, like you mentioned before. So how do you interpret how Iran sees negotiations at this point, given the statements they've put out?
There's always a difficult domestic and international game that, decision makers have to play when they come up with these statements. It's not at all surprising to see inflammatory rhetoric coming out of Iran. This sometimes is signaling and it's sometimes for domestic purposes. In terms of the conditions for future diplomacy or talks, I would say that I wouldn't look too much into statements. Ultimately, the ultimate arbitrator on this is the Supreme Leader himself. And so partly you see the, parts of the establishment trying to save face for the failure of the 12-day war, but also to show their kind of resolve and their strength in face of adversity. I wouldn't look too much into that, but I could be wrong here.
And where is this all headed? Like, where do you think this is going? Is this going to head to more war? Or will it force Iran into taking some sort of step or measure for their own survival at this point, given how weakened they are and the regional dynamics at play, like you mentioned, with the loss of their proxies and with their ally Bashar al-Assad and so on and so forth?
Well, I think there's like few pathways that could happen. I mean, one could be the snapback goes forward, sanctions are reimposed on Iran, and Iran does nothing. Alternatively, Iran could withdraw from the NPT. This is where you might see another, conflict between Iran and Israel as more Israeli strikes on Iran's program, because they'll use the excuse that now we can't see Iran's nuclear program. We no longer have inspectors, and Iran is now openly trying to develop a nuclear weapon by withdrawing from the NPT. I think that's one path. Another path, and I think this is unlikely, is that there is some negotiation or some agreement where snapback is extended for a 6-month period. And likely if we know anything about what Iranian negotiating strategy is, they'll prolong the negotiations as long as possible, try to get as much as possible, but then typically never really follow through with it. And this is what we saw around 2022, I believe, with the E3 and the Europeans, where they were on the cusp of an agreement, and Iran continued to kind of stonewall and delay. I think Iran ideally would like to just see the snapback expire and termination day happen without sanctions, but that's unlikely. So I do think, I tend to be more pessimistic, as I do think that we're heading towards another crisis. Whether it be diplomatic when it comes to the NPT, or even potentially kinetic when it comes to potential Israeli strikes. However, the question is, what would Israel really target at this point? You can't really, the HU and Esfahan is not, it's fortified enough that, well, first off, there would be radiation issues, but secondly, there would also be issues of actually accessing it. So I think a diplomatic path at least is the best way forward, but I think that I wouldn't be too confident that we're going to have a solution, though I'd like to be proven wrong on that.
And could this do anything to the power and the regime itself? Like, is that tied in with its nuclear capabilities and all of this that you mentioned, and the possibility for more kinetic measures?
Yeah, the distinction between the regime's conventional and nuclear capabilities is interesting, because, they do, in terms of ground forces, is they do have Iran has one of the largest militaries in the Middle East, and they still have the conventional side of it. But what the nuclear program gave the regime, and what it still gives the regime, is this bargaining leverage. And it is the ultimate fear of potentially going down the nuclear path. So in that sense, it's kind of this, latent capability, or kind of, shadow capability that they have at their disposal. But that showed to be really, it showed to be fragile. And I think that the 12-day war really showed that. I think that you'll see Iran focusing a lot more on conventional capabilities, and especially its missile force. I think that there hasn't been that shift in terms of, maybe we should develop an air force and really focus more on, civil defense measures. I think that they will continue down that path. But with the nuclear program, it's unclear what the value is beyond negotiations at this point for them. And I guess national pride, which is something that they keep on saying during talks, is that they have the right to enrich for national pride. Though they have that agreement with Bushehr, and they don't enrich uranium for Bushehr. That's supplied by the Russians. So that's like kind of a model for zero enrichment, though the Iranians never really acknowledge that.
So if there's one key takeaway from our conversation today, what is it that you would want our audience to know? It sounds like that we are headed potentially to a nuclear crisis, and that the U.S. could step up and do something.
A crisis is not inevitable. It's possible, it's somewhat likely, and it may look different than what some of our projections, or what some of the specialists are assuming. However, the U.S. plays a critical role here. I think Iran has the assumption that even in discussions with the E3 or various other intermediaries in the region, they're speaking to the U.S. I think the U.S. has always been the primary concern for the Iranians, and so at the moment, with the U.S. somewhat taking a back seat to this, it creates this context where there's multiple narratives going on and multiple imperatives from different countries on what they want to achieve. If the Iranians restore IAEA inspections and resume negotiations with the United States, I think we'd be in a better off position. However, because of the kind of stubbornness and also retrenched attitude that they have at the moment within Iran, I think that's unlikely. And so either there's a diplomatic crisis with NPT withdrawal or potentially something kinetic. But it's not a foregone conclusion. These things change quite quickly, as we've seen over the past few years.
Thank you so much. That's Nicole Grajewski. Thank you for sharing your wealth of knowledge and your expertise with us to break it all down today.
Thank you so much for having me.
You can sign up for our weekly briefing newsletter at iranintl.com/newsletter. We deliver what you need to know with top stories, key analysis, and exclusive reports direct to your inbox. The Eye for Iran podcast series is brought to you by Iran International, your go-to destination for expert Iranian news in both Farsi and English. For more, head to our dedicated English website, iranintl.com/en.